Hello my loves, and a very warm, toasty welcome back to The Library is Open. So I hope you brought your library cards, my darlings. Yes indeed, a warm and toasty welcome from a country that is anything but right now, both literally and metaphorically. But that's what makes these online spaces so great, isn't it? In that we can connect with people and spread a little bit of virtual warmth across the globe and between us as friends, I hope, and fellow library patrons, I should say. I've just been slapping my hot water bottle here, which I'm using for warmth because I didn't put the electricity on for the bill, so that's Britain for you in 2022. But I hope you're all well. You haven't seen me for a few weeks now. I think it's been about a month by the time I upload this now. It's been pretty full-on month, not in a bad way necessarily. There's just been a lot going on, and after I'd done the Halloween reading challenge, I thought, you know what, I'm going to give myself a little bit of time to develop a spot. So there you go, isn't that lovely? But I have still been reading, and I want to update you a little bit about that today because there were several kind of, I guess, important public events and also readathons that were happening over the course of the month of November, of which we are now almost at the end. And I have been reading alongside them without necessarily acknowledging that on Booktube, but I just sort of wanted to check in on my tardiness for reporting back on them, which I think is it's been quite a nice way to curate my reading actually over the month, because I don't know, I'm at the stage now almost where I feel like I'm not just reading always what I would naturally gravitate towards, but I'm more sort of reading along with a kind of, I guess, theme, or almost like a public practice, you know, like everyone's doing this kind of reading at the moment, so actually that could be really interesting because I wouldn't normally read that kind of material. So there we are, and I think it's been really, really good, and again it keeps expanding my horizons, as does the Library is Open book club, the final session of which is going to take place on the 18th of December of this month. Details in the description as always. And this month we are reading The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I'm really, really looking forward to getting stuck into. So yeah, so what's been going on in November, readathon and kind of, I guess, cultural wise, that I've been reading towards. So this is actually very late. I'm very tardy for Victober, which is the kind of readathon that centres around reading Victorian fiction and so on and so forth, or related things over that month. What I wish I'd read, because I didn't have a copy of it at the time, I'm hoping I've got one now, I think it's on the way, is a book called Black Victorians, which the name of the author escapes me at the moment, but I will put it in the description. Just make a little note there for myself. Is it John Woolf? I think it might be John Woolf actually, which kind of traces the history of, you know, the population, I guess, en masse of the Victorian era, and particularly how Black people, also Asian people, people of colour generally, are written out of kind of established white histories, but actually they've been there all along, because of course they have. So I'm hoping to get to that, but I didn't read that for Victober. What I did read instead was this, which was recommended by the very lovely Charlie Brooks. Their channel will be linked down below. I'll make another note of that. I have to note these things down now, I'll forget when I'm writing my descriptions. Yes, she recommended Harriet Martineau's DEERBROOK, which is set in the village of DEERBROOK, funnily enough. You notice that a lot with like older, like classic titles and so on and so forth. They often have like quite innocuous titles that are just like the name of the place, or, you know, something like that. Whereas, I don't know, maybe someone should do a study in evolution of titles over the years. I don't know. But anyway, this is kind of what I found really intriguing about this, because, you know, I love Victoriana anyway. And it's one of my favourite historical periods, even though I know full well I would have been a chimney sweep or a housemaid, but there we go, such is life. This is kind of, it kind of occupies a special position in literary history, in that it was out of print for quite a while, I believe, but it's been brought back, obviously, and it's a lovely Penguin Classics edition. And it's kind of acknowledged now as one of the earliest novels of like Victorian domesticity and like real people's lives. I think it was published originally in 1839, so it's quite early in the 19th century, sorry. And the plot is very, very basic, but that was in its sense revolutionary for the time. So it's about these two sisters, the Ibbotson sisters, Hester and Margaret, who they come to stay with their cousin in the village of DEERBROOK. They come from Birmingham, and there's all this speculation, village gossip, you know, that one of them's going to marry the apothecary, who is called Edward Hope. And he initially prefers Margaret, but ends up being kind of convinced by gossip that it's Hester that is in love with him, so he should marry her and do the right thing. And that sort of happens. And then they get married, and the marriage is a little bit troubled at first, and so on and so forth. And there's, you know, the usual kind of emotional upheavals when you get involved with people that maybe you're after someone else. And also he ends up voting in a local election, which is apparently not something that doctors are supposed to do. So half the village turns against him, spurred on by some sort of like malicious gossip. And they accuse him of all sorts, like grave robbing and malpractice and so on and so forth. And then the family start to lose money, and it's about how they survived, how they come through that, how misunderstandings are righted, all the kind of classics of Victorian fiction, really. But yeah, so what is really, really interesting about this is kind of how it holds the attention so much for like almost a 600-page novel about very little. And also I think what it teaches us about, I guess, reading habits over the centuries, and how tastes change with time, and how prose changes with time as well. I think that's most interesting when we look at older fiction and stuff like that, in the sense that the prose here, and I think the author does a lovely job, by the way, is it's quite effusive, it's quite florid, that's not a criticism, and it's quite full. Whereas I think what we're tending to see a lot these days, less so in genre fiction, but particularly in kind of contemporary fiction, is that the sparseness of prose is really being embraced, and direct storytelling, whereas this is full of detail and the kind of pastoral that you'd expect from the Victorian novel. But I had a really, really good time with this, and I think particularly for a female author, and particularly for an early example of what would become the kind of domestic novel, I think it's really, really noteworthy. And it's actually quite a lot of fun as well, to say that it's quite depressing in terms of the action. I had a good time with this. This was my train companion on the way to work for several weeks. So yeah, that was my contribution to Victober. Now, what I read there was a readathon, and the name escapes me at the moment, which is very bad of me, but I will link the person who started the readathon. Again, I heard about this from Charlie, who I mentioned, and this was a readathon to celebrate native people's books, indigenous authors, basically, from the kind of global diaspora. And I chose to listen to an audiobook for this, which was a great choice because it had a full star cast, and this was called The Removed by Brandon Hobson, which was a novel about a family, and they're the kind of youngest, well, not the youngest son, but one of the children, who was an impressionist. He did really good impressions of people, very smart, very well loved, so on and so forth, was killed, unfortunately, quite early on. It's not a spoiler, in an accident, and it's kind of about how their lives pan out from that one event, you know, like in sort of ripples. And it's really heavily inspired by Cherokee people, and the kind of myths and legends, and, you know, way of life of that particular group of people. And you know, it kind of follows how different generations, particularly from that culture, have both responded to that event and responded, I guess, globally to world events. And as I said, the audiobook was beautiful because I think it was about 6 or 7 actors, I think, who voiced each of the different, because it's I think it was 4 or 5 different viewpoints that we get throughout as we follow the stories of the sister, the brother, the mother, the father, and then there's another one as well, which kind of deals more heavily with like myths and legend. That kind of runs through the book, and these were all distinct voices, and the actors, you know, really did a lovely job. And as we know, a narrator or narrators can make or break a book. What I loved so much about this was how vivid the voices felt, and I suspect that's probably to do with both the writing and the performances, in terms of that distinctive quality that really kind of spoke to each person's story. And do you know what? It's really funny because I'd had this in my audio app for absolutely ages. I bought it on, I don't want to say a whim, but I thought it sounded good and I just hadn't got around to reading it. And I knew I wanted to make this video to kind of sum up what I've been doing in November. So it just seemed like the perfect thing to kind of, little pen jump there, to kind of tick that off the agenda. But I would really recommend this, particularly, you know, if you're looking for stories that don't shirk away from how Indigenous people have been displaced, mistreated, and what the effects of that are as they span out over the generations. But yeah, really compelling. Got through this very, very quickly. Admittedly, I listened to it on 1.5 speed, because I saw another YouTuber do that the other week, and I thought, oh, efficient. But I still had a great experience with it, so that was really, really nice. Moving on to Trans Awareness Week, which was November the 13th to the 19th, and also taking in Trans Day of Remembrance. I decided to finally read, and I had an ulterior motive as well. I knew I wanted to read some literature or non-fiction by someone trans, but I also I'm doing an article for a magazine at the moment that I've pitched as dealing with non-binary identity, which is my identity, and I wanted to see what was more of what was already being said about that, so I can, you know, call on my kind of MB siblings in either support or contradiction to what is being said, because I think that's important. So I read, finally, Travis Alabanza's None of the Above, Reflections on Life Beyond the Binary, which was, it's a kind of personal, kind of, what would we call it, a kind of personal reckoning with their own feelings about gender, transness, being or living outside of the gender binary in quite, and it's told through phrases that were said to them, which I think is really, really interesting approach, and it's kind of repeated motif. So for instance, the chapters you get are, so when did you know, but I mean proper trans, ladies, gentlemen, and those lucky enough to transcend gender, this ain't a thing we do around here, son, so what do you want me to call it? Children sacrificed to appease trans lobby. That's a headline in a newspaper, by the way, which is gross. And this is for us, baby, not for them. And what I love about Travis's work, and I think they've done it a lot in the past because they're also a playwright and performer. I saw them in Jubilee at the Royal Exchange a few years ago. And they've also done the plays Burgers and Overflow at the Bush Theatre. The latter was, I can't remember where Burgers premiered. But they really don't shy away from asking the hard questions that maybe even fellow non-binary people don't always want to ask themselves or put themselves in a position to have to reckon with. You know, I mean, I've had to sort of, you know, really, really interrogate myself as a non-binary person, thinking about, actually, do I want to, you know, engage with the fact that for many people, not all, I hasten to add, that non-binary is a trans identity. So technically, am I trans? Or do I sit within the trans family, I guess? But what Travis does beautifully as well is give us space to not have to decide everything, and also to not have to justify ourselves to people. And they do that by really unpacking, not for the first time, obviously, like some of this is established stuff in queer theory and academia and stuff, but on a really kind of personal, embodied level. And they also talk a lot about how race and, you know, cultural upbringing intersect with non-binary and trans identities in a really, really interesting way. And again, provides great arguments for why the gender binary hurts everyone, irrespective of whether they consider themselves cis or trans, which is an important thing I always think to state. A lot of, you know, isms, phobias, so on and so forth, don't just harm the people they're about, they harm the people who use them as well. Like, homophobia harms straight people, you know, racism harms white people, misogyny harms men, and so on and so forth, you know what I mean? Not in the same way and not in the same level of directness, obviously, but it perpetuates a culture that ultimately seeks to govern. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed this. I will be using this as reference when I come to kind of drafting the article through, which I do need to do reasonably soon, actually, so I better get on with that. But yeah, this was lovely. Really, really recommend this one if you want to find out more about what it means to be non-binary, or to live beyond rigid ideas around gender, or just unpack more of what that might mean, you know. And then finally, because November is usually on Booktube kind of christened, if I may, non-fiction November, I finally got around to reading this, which I've owned for a while, and I don't know why I haven't touched it. I heard about it from a colleague who is an academic, and I knew that it dealt quite heavily with COVID in some respects, and I thought, have I got enough distance from that to want to read about that yet? Because I don't think I do, because it isn't over. But this is Virology, Essays for the Living, the Dead, and the Small Things in Between by Joseph Osmundson, who is a microbiologist at NYU, but also a writer, and not just like an academic and critical writer, but also a writer of prose, of fiction as well. He has 2 other books. The names escape me at the moment, but they were... I do want to pick up copies of them because I liked his writing style. And what he's kind of doing here is talking through reflections, I guess, on virology and diseases, but using COVID as the kind of jumping off point. And they are very much a book of essays, so you can read them and dip in and out independently, although I did read them straight through. And what's lovely is, although it's non-fiction and it does contain a certain amount of like academic and scientific material, it's totally accessible. You can read it like a novel, even though it's entirely non-fiction. Well, as non-fiction as writing can ever be, in the sense that it's always from the writer's, you know, perception and belief. And I think what he does beautifully is talk about queerness. As a queer person, he talks about viruses, and he talks about culture on a large scale, you know. It's got a flash of Wham then. Did you like that? Yeah, it's nearly Christmas, sue me. Get a warrant. No, I'm joking. Yeah, he talks about all those things and brings them into conversation with each other in a really delicate way that kind of looks at the construction of viruses, what viruses mean, what it means about us as a species, how we communicate together, and what it means to abject people because of or inspired by, you know, viruses. He talks a lot about the act of writing as well, which I really, really loved. Why have I turned this page down? There was something beautiful. Oh yeah, he talks a lot about binaries in here as well, not specifically about non-binary identities, but again, read that article. I'm thinking a lot about what's created in the space between binaries, if that makes sense. So like what it gives us the opportunity to do, think about and probe. So I've turned that down, but I also thought this was beautiful as a piece of writing. Where is it now? Oh, that's annoying. I've just said that and now I can't find it. Basically, it included a thought about writing that I'd read somewhere else, and now I can't remember where I read it, but it must be in the chapter on writing. But what it basically is about unpacking this idea about the kind of nobility of writing, I suppose, or the idea that writing can save. Here we go. I love this. One can write about one's fragility. The act of writing doesn't make one strong. Brave, perhaps. One can write about paralyzing dread, tears that overtake a body. The act of writing does not negate the lived experience of horror. One can write horrified. One can write while crying. And the original piece of writing I was looking for was one called, it wasn't called anything. I can't remember what it was called. It basically said, writing won't make anyone love you. Which I really like. Well, I hate it because my whole life has been based on that now. But I really like that idea that actually the act of writing in and of itself is a means and a way of thinking through the world, but it won't necessarily have the effect, nor does it have to happen under the conditions that you think it will. I hope that wasn't really convoluted. It probably was, but you chose to spend time with me, so here we are. So there we go, and that's what I've been reading in November. It's lovely to check in and to get like gossiping again, and I hope that was decent content. I will be posting regularly over December for my little advent calendar. The library is Advent. I'll come up with a different name. Maybe the advent calendar is open. I don't know yet. Or similar attempts at wit. But I will leave all the details of the things that I couldn't remember off the top of my head in the description, and apologies to any of the authors or people concerned if I wasn't able to recall directly exactly what the name of books, names, people were. That's my bad, and that's not a reflection on how important I think your contributions are, obviously. But for now, let's put our library cards somewhere safe, my angels, and let me know how your November's been, if it's been as wet, cold and gloomy as it has here, and which books you've been using to kind of light up those late nights. But for now, do take care, try and keep warm if you can, and I will see you very, very soon, my darlings. Vive la biblioteca. Bye.